Hello, my name is Professor Beams, and I teach at Austin Community College. I teach several different classes, including general botany, propagation and greenhouse operations, green garden management. But anybody who knows me knows that my passion is soils. And one of my favorite classes to teach is Intro to Soils. This is a little mini lecture that gives some insight on what we cover in the Intro to Soils class with the ACC Landscape Design Department. This is the lecture that I give at the end of the general botany course in order to kind of give people an idea for what's coming up in the next class, but also even if the students elect to not take the Intro to Soils class, if you are delving into the world of botany, it's a good idea to also include an understanding of what's going on in the soil. So this is a very brief, very basic um, introduction to what is going on with the area beneath our feet. So I want to start with discussing what soil is. Soil is not dirt. Dirt is under your fingernails, it's on your pants, it's on your kitchen floor, and you have to clean it up. If it's outside on the ground, it's soil. And I always like to say that it is a dynamic natural body. And when we say dynamic, what we mean is it is constantly changing. Now, in a moment, I'm going to talk about the different fractions that make up soil. There's the mineral fraction, which is stable and not very dynamic, versus the organic fraction. To many laymen, if we say put compost in your soil, that sounds familiar. The compost is part of the organic fraction and it constantly changes. So within our soil system, ideally, we will have a robust, vibrant, diverse web of ecology living in the soil. And that does require for there to be ebbs and flows in activity, booms of reproduction in microbial masses, larger areas of growth in certain times of the year with plants, with algae, things of that nature. But it's important to understand that our soil is constantly changing in pretty much all cultivated and manicured settings in the soil. So I'm talking about garden beds, landscapes, um, field production for agriculture. We're going to need to sort of continuously manage the nutrient cycles. There is no single silver bullet to where put this on your soil once and you will never have to worry about it again. That's not really the case, and we're going to go into why that is through these next slides. So, it's important to understand that while soil has many, many functions on the planet, and there are many different benefits that human beings specifically derive from the soil, as well as, all of the systems on Earth, there are three functions specifically related to plant growth. The first is the soil acts as a bank of nutrients and minerals. Just like our bodies, plant bodies cannot grow and thrive and be healthy in an absence of minerals and nutrients. Just like we need our calories in order to be able to carry out all of our tasks and activities throughout the day, plants have their tasks and activities with growth and reproduction, and they need fuel with which to do it. So the soil is where they get that fuel. The second is the same thing for water. The soil is a bank for water. Now, a very small amount of water can enter a plant through its leaves, but not a significant enough amount to sustain the plant for long periods of time. Now, this is a very, very general rule. There are always exceptions. But if we're thinking about a pretty standard garden bed with edible fruits, cut flowers, herbs, things like that, if we're thinking about a typical landscape. And now, for context, as I mentioned, I teach for Austin Community College. I am in Central Texas, and that's pretty much what I teach to. Um, the plants here are not adapted to be able to pull a sufficient amount of water out of the atmosphere. It needs to come from the root system, and the roots are located in the soil. And then the third thing is it acts as an anchor. The soil anchors the plants in place. And now this is an important thing to start to wrap your head around because as you start to grow plants from seed, grow plants from cutting, buy large plants from a nursery and start planting those, it's important to note that there are different types of soils that are appropriate for different tasks. For example, when we want to grow plants from a seed, we are going to use a really light, fluffy material that has a higher percentage of soft organic matter, like peat moss in it, because we want for those seeds, when they push out their first little leaf, their first cotyledon, when that comes out, we don't want it to meet a lot of resistance. When it pushes out its first little root, its hypocotyl, we don't want it to meet resistance. As more roots start to push outward, we want those root hairs to easily push past the various particles of soil that it's living in without meeting resistance and without having to put more effort than necessary into making those roots. Now, that means we want a really light, fluffy material that if you had it outside in your hand on a breezy day, it would likely blow out of your hand. Versus if we buy a 3-year-old fruit tree and we want to plant it outside or in a large pot, that really light, fluffy soil is not going to be appropriate because the tree, if it doesn't already have a canopy of branches and leaves, it's going to develop a canopy of branches and leaves on a stalk that is a few to several feet high. So that means that we have basically a sail, a bunch of leaves catching wind on a top heavy plant. We need some soil that's going to be much more structurally sound, that's going to be able to hold that plant in place. So in that case, we want less of the light, fluffy organic matter, and we want something that's going to be more compacted, a little bit heavier, getting more into that mineral fraction of soils. So that's why I mentioned here that soil acts as an anchor to plants because we need to understand what kind of plant is going to require what kind of soil. Once we select our plants, that's going to inform the soil type that we are aiming for. So it's really important to distinguish between a healthy soil and an unhealthy soil or a soil with lower quality. Um, every semester I have a student come to me and say, Beams, I have bad soil. And I'm like, well, how bad is it? Like, is it robbing liquor stores? Is it cussing out old ladies? Or is it just not meeting the needs that you would likely, ideally, want to see your soil carry out? So a healthy soil is able to sustain life. It's able to sustain plant life. It's able to sustain microbial life. So that's going to be our Microorganisms, which include bacteria, fungi, and nematodes, anything that is invisible to the naked eye, but definitely is living, growing, and reproducing in the soil system. We also want to be able to support life in the form of arthropods and reptiles and small rodents, birds, things like that. We all live on the soil. The food web that exists above the surface of the soil depends on the food web that exists below the surface of the soil. So, if we can use our soil to support life as well as maintain environmental quality, and that means a couple of things. One, water is purified and filtered through soil. So if water picks up a bunch of, let's say, demolition dust from a construction site, and so the water running off is full of all of this stuff that we wouldn't want to drink, we wouldn't want to get in our water system. It filters through the layers of soil until it is much cleaner when it hits the aquifer, when it hits the groundwater system, or when it gets into a larger body of water like a lake or a river. So the soil does cleanse water in that way. Soil is also an incredible bank for carbon. Now, most of us know a lot about climate change and global warming, and one of the driving factors of climate change and global warming is an excess of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that comes from two things. The first thing is we have industrial air pollution that comes from, large manufacturing facilities as well as a lot of, vehicles on the road. All of that increases the amount of carbon dioxide that ends up in our atmosphere, but we are also reducing the amount of vegetation that is growing, just the surface area of trees. So, for example, there might be a lot of property somewhere in your town that has always just kind of been grass and shrubs and trees and different things, but now it's for sale and it's being advertised as a commercial development property. Well, what that means is all of those trees and all of those shrubs and the grasses are going to be demolished and then covered in concrete. So, we are reducing the amount of vegetation that is able to process the CO2 in the atmosphere through photosynthesis, but also the soil has an incredible capacity to bank carbon. So let's talk about the buzz term, carbon sequestration. For those of us who watched a lot of Law and Order and procedurals, at some point in our lives, we know that when a court jury is sequestered, it means they are taken and they are held together in one place. The idea in carbon sequestration is we are sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere into solid matter. And that's good. That's a good thing for our climate because we are taking more of that CO2 out of the atmosphere where we have concentrations that are higher than the planet is built for as it currently functions. So we are taking the carbon out of the atmosphere and we are then putting it into solid matter. And that can exist in the soil not only in the form of plants, but exponentially more in the form of microbial biomasses. And that's what I mentioned before with the bacteria, fungi, and nematodes. The more we have of those little guys in a robust, thriving, diverse ecosystem, the more carbon we can pull out of the atmosphere. So that is how soil can promote environmental quality. And then, of course, promoting plant, animal, and human health, as I mentioned a moment ago. So soil texture is the single most important physical property of soil. Soil has physical properties that can be determined with our five senses And then they have chemical properties that can be tested for through chemicals and labs and things like that. So the soil physical property of texture is determined by touch. The texture will determine how easily water flows through the soil, how well water is held in the soil, and how well plants grow in it. So you can start with determining texture of soil by just putting some in your palm, getting it a little bit wet and rubbing it around. It might have a gritty texture. It might have a smooth texture. It might have a sticky texture. All of those different feelings in your hand are clues as to what your soil is composed of. So, a moment ago, I mentioned that there's the soil mineral fraction and the soil organic fraction. We're going to talk about the mineral fraction right now. So, the soil is made up of different sized particles, and that is what determines how it feels in your hand, which is synonymous with what is the texture. Is it gritty? Is it smooth? Is it sticky? Each of these particles are determined by size. A soil particle is going to be anything 2 millimeters or less in diameter. Anything larger than 2 millimeters, we're going to consider that to be gravel. So I've got this very tiny little ruler, and we can see here that the 0 to 1 centimeter, there are 10 little tick marks between them. So 2 millimeters is two tick marks, and you can see at the end of my nail that's not well manicured, you can see that two tick marks is very, very small. It's essentially a grain of sand, which is literally what we're talking about here. So the soil texture is the relative proportions of sand, silt, and clay. Sand, silt, and clay are the three mineral soil separates, the combination of which will determine soil texture. So let's look at this graphic. On the right-hand side, we see an illustration of three different sizes. The largest one represents a grain of sand. So a grain of sand can measure up to 2 millimeters in diameter, all the way down to 0.05 millimeters in diameter. It is by far the largest. So if we move our eyeballs over to the left-hand side of the screen, we can see a photo zoomed in of sand, and then we see a little artistic representation of individual sand particles. And we can see that at 10 times magnification, they are irregular in shape and they have irregular edges, which is what causes that gritty texture. Um, and they are fairly large in size. Then going back to the right-hand side of the graphic, the gray part, we can see towards the top of the inside of the large circle, we have a smaller circle, and that is the representation of silt. Silt is sized anywhere from 0.05 millimeters to 0.002 millimeters. Very, very tiny. Silt comes from the bottom of bodies of water. So if we think about putting rocks through a rock tumbler, over a period of weeks, rocks with rough exteriors will get tumbled and smoothed down to nice, shiny, smooth, possibly beautifully colored individual rocks. Now, imagine much smaller than those rocks, but at the bottom of a river or a lake that has some movement in it, or a river that turns into a lake. We're talking about millennia, thousands of years of these tiny little particles of silica, which is the same thing sand is made of, but they have been tumbled and smoothed. And so the outsides of their surface are very, very smooth. So when you rub silt in your hand, it feels silken. So we can see on the left-hand side of this graphic, individual small circular shapes. And again, this is 10 times magnification. If you hold a bunch of silt in your hand, you will not be able to see the individual particles in the way that you could, with good young eyes, see individual particles of sand if you held them in your hand. And then the last one is clay. So clay is teeny, 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 tiny. And clay is amazing. Clay has very strong, dominant physical and chemical properties. And that is a combination of A, the size, and B, clay has a negative charge. Sand and silt are neutral. They are chemically inert. They do not have a charge to them. Whereas clay has a negatively charged site, which means it can interact with positively charged molecules like minerals and nutrients that are found in the soil system. So, what I want to discuss now is the concept of surface area. Surface area the is the sum of all of the outer surfaces. If we're talking about three-dimensional objects, it's all of the outer surfaces of an object or a group of objects. So if we have a cup of sand and a cup of silt, all dry, and a cup of clay, which one has the greater surface area? Let's step back and let's think about it in more practical terms. We're not all familiar with sand, silt, and clay, but we are familiar with basketballs, ping pong balls, and sequins. So, what if we had big 50-gallon trash bins and we filled one with basketballs, and that is going to represent sand? We have ping pong balls in the second one representing silt. And then we have sequins representing clay in the third one. And then we pour water all the way to the top in each of them. Which one is going to hold the most water? Now, normally we would all immediately say the basketballs. The sand is going to hold the most water. While it's true that the size of the gaps between the basketballs are larger than the other two, the overall total volume of space between each of the basketballs is actually the lowest. So clay, you can see on the left-hand side of our screen, looks like plates or bricks stacked on top of each other. And while these two above it are 10 times magnification, this one at the bottom, this is 1,000 times magnification. Clay is tiny, 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 tiny. And so even though we think, well, a basketball has a larger surface area than a sequin, what if we filled the basketball with sequins and we added up the surface area of each individual sequin inside the basketball? So not only do we have the surface area of the outside of the basketball, which is the basketball surface area, we have that plus all of these tiny particles inside the basketball, which leads me to pore space, as I just mentioned. Smaller fractions result in a higher surface area within a given volume. Higher surface area yields greater pore space. So the smaller the fractions, the more water the soil can hold. And just one of my favorite little facts, a tablespoon of clay has the same surface area as a football field. So very, very high surface area that comes as a result of having very, very small individual particles. So that is the mineral fraction, sand, silt, and clay. We good? We've got it. Let's move on to the organic fraction. So the organic fraction is anything carbon-based. We are carbon-based. Whatever we ate for breakfast was carbon-based. If you're sitting in front of a wooden table, that is based in carbon. Plants are based in carbon. Animals are based of carbon. Insects, microbes, all of those things are carbon-based. You know, it's not carbon-based is sand, silt, and clay. Metals, they typically, unless it's a composite, gold does not have carbon in it. It's gold. Silver is just silver. Iron is iron, right? So anything that's carbon based is is or has been part of a living organism. So the organic part of our soil is derived from plants, animals, microbes, or anything that came out of them, if you know what I mean, a waste product. So we have three different states. The first is litter. Litter is the undecayed parts of any plant, animal, microbe tissue, any residue that comes from the top of plants. So let's say the oak tree that dropped its leaves on the ground, and you can pick up a leaf and you can say, this was an oak tree. I know what this is. And that's just litter. That's organic litter that's sitting on the top of the ground. Then it starts to break down a little bit and it becomes duff, which is partially decayed. So while with litter, you could see this is an oak leaf, and from my compost bin, this is a banana peel, and this is an eggshell, and this is an apple core. When you get down to duff, you can say, I know this was a leaf, but I don't know what kind of leaf it was. It's too decomposed for me to tell. Or I can definitely tell that those things were kitchen scraps. Or I can tell that that was an eggshell, but I don't know if it was one of the white eggs or the brown eggs. Then we decompose all the way down to humus or humic matter, which is basically the stable fraction of soil organic matter after all of the residues have decomposed. So, if you've ever made your own compost, or heck, if you've ever bought compost, what you are looking for, what you get is that rich, dark brown, sort of chocolate cake kind of mass where you can't tell what was a leaf or what was an apple core or what was a banana peel. But it's all broken down into this organic matter, and that is humic material. So we can add any of these three categories to our soil, but the higher up we are on this list, if it's litter or duff, it's going to have to go through more steps of decomposition to directly benefit the plants in the soil versus humic material is ready for its final uh, extraction of its materials into base minerals and atoms. So, organic material functions in very important ways in our soil. The first is it increases water holding capacity. So now we're going to move into an example I like to use, which is the difference between mineral and organic parts of the soil. And so the example we're going to use is the mineral is going to be represented by a ball of aluminum foil, and the organic is going to be represented by a loofah sponge. Um, I'm sure we've seen loofah sponges at the store in a bar of soap that we bought. Maybe you grow them, maybe you've seen them at a farmer's market. And let me tell you, friends, if you haven't been washing your dishes with a loofah sponge and then composting it when you're done, you haven't lived. Go get yourself a loofah sponge and see how you can use it in your kitchen until it's time to return that organic matter from whence it came. Anyways, let's imagine we have a ball of aluminum foil and we have a loofah sponge, and we dunk both of them into a bucket of water and pull them out. Which one is going to hold more water? It's going to be that loofah sponge, right? Because the ball of aluminum is going to have all of that water that hit the surfaces run off. And then once it dries, versus the loofah sponge, it has a bunch of small pores, and the loofah itself, the organic matter, is chemically charged. So the negative charge on the organic matter is going to interact with the polar charge on the droplets of water. And so it's going to hold water in there. It does the same thing with the soil. So we know that, we'll get into the water hold, different types of soil water in a second. I'm notorious for getting ahead of myself because I get so excited. So once The once the organic matter decomposes in the soil, what was once carbon chains, which is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that are attached to all kinds of other things, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, zinc, boron, aluminum, all of those things that are attached to make different types of plant and animal tissues, when they are broken down from their humic state one last time, those minerals are then released into the soil, and that is what is available for plant uptake. Um, as I mentioned a moment ago, organic materials have a negative charge, just like clay. So, clay and organic matter are how mineral cations are exchanged in the soil sites. So, if we only had sand and silt comprising our soil, we have no clay and we have no organic matter, our soil is going to be unable to hold on to any positively charged minerals, and something that might be sitting in the soil system with a good rain or some kind of water event, it's all going to get washed out, which we refer to as leaching. It's going to leach all of those minerals from the soil. However, if we have minerals that have a positive charge, which we call cations, and then we've got negatively charged soil sites like clay and organic matter, even if there is a water event, that that soil site is going to be able to hold a cation that can then remain in the soil system for plant uptake. And the last one I list here is organic matter helps to maintain soil structure. So, soil texture is how it feels. It's the relative proportions of sand, silt, and clay. Soil structure is how the individual particles of the soil aggregate together. So we've got soil clods, we've got clumps, we've got aggregates. Sometimes they're big and blocky, sometimes they're fine, and we've got like a really nice, smooth seed bed. It's got a really fine tilth. Organic matter is going to help in maintaining the structure of the soil. So let's think about it in terms of the ball of aluminum versus the loofah sponge. Let's say we have each in our hand and we squeeze them. When you open your hand back up, the ball of aluminum is going to maintain the shape of the inside of your fist. The loofah sponge is going to rebound and regain its shape. So the same thing works in the soil, where if you only have mineral soil, the more compaction it sees, the more compacted it becomes. Versus if you have a good amount of organic matter in the soil, after a compacting event, it will spring back a good bit. So it really helps to maintain the structure of the soil. Now, within the soil, I've mentioned at least a couple of times now, we ideally want to find a diverse, robust ecology. So we want a food web. We want lots of soil organisms because they all work together. So we have bacteria, we have fungi. There's an anaerobic form of bacteria called actinomyces. In certain systems, algae will grow in the soil. We also have nematodes. Nematodes are very, very interesting little critters. I do not have time to go into it right now, but if you want to learn more about nematodes, there are lots and lots of resources online. Or if you want to take my online class through ACC, I teach integrated pest management in the fall. Then we, of course, also have our worms and insects. Any soil-borne earthworm, millipede, centipede, or arthropod of, insect or other variety, anything that goes into the soil system that lives in there plays a part in the soil food web. So the organisms themselves have many functions. Um, the first is they all have a waste product that is an organic acid. Um, and that organic acid helps to dissolve the minerals in the soil. So plants are only able to take up mineral forms of nutrients. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And when I say mineral, What I mean is it is not organic, which is to say it's not attached to carbon, which is to say it's no longer still a part of a plant structure, an animal structure, or a microorganism structure. Hope that makes sense. So, if there is a big, juicy beetle that has been living in the soil and is full of protein and has lots of nitrogen, nitrogen is essential for creating proteins, and it dies in the soil system, the plant cannot reach a root down into its body and slurp up the nitrogen. That juicy beetle has to has to decompose, and as the body of the beetle breaks down into humic material and then break down beyond that, then the minerals are released from the no longer existing corpse into mineral elements and nutrients. So, living organisms in the soil system contribute to that. So, they use their organic acids and then they will also eat and break down organic matter, and the nutrients can be released that way. The organisms play an important part, as I mentioned before, carbon sequestration. So let's say that we have an abundant, robust ecosystem in the soil with lots of bacteria and fungi, and each of those individual tiny, tiny, tiny organisms is made of carbon. It's holding carbon. It's also holding nitrogen and all of the other things that make up its little body. When they die, they will then release those nutrients back into the soil system. There are specific types of bacteria that help to fix nitrogen in the soil. And by fixing nitrogen, we mean that they are turning organic forms of nitrogen into mineral forms of nitrogen that then become available for plant uptake. Um, Legumes are most people who've even dipped a toe in the gardening world are familiar with nitrogen fixing legumes. The misconception there is that the plants themselves pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and inject it into the soil. That's very creative and it is not correct. What the legumes do is they foster an incredible environment for nitrogen fixing bacteria. So let's say you have a little bit of these nitrogen fixing bacteria living in your soil system, but then you plant these specific legumes in there that are very symbiotic with those nitrobacters, nitrogen fixing bacteria. The nitrogen fixing bacteria will then see these sites, these incredible breeding grounds that they can just burst forth with reproduction and grow a massive colony exponentially greater than what was already present in the soil, just because the root system of these legumes are so perfect for that. Then since they have increased their numbers in volume, in mass, there's more of these nitrobacters, more nitrogen gets fixed and becomes available in the soil. So again, the plants are not fixing the nitrogen. They are creating the perfect breeding ground for the bacteria that do fix the nitrogen, which is just as good. It's nice to know what's actually happening in there. Of course, there are some benefits, some physical benefits to moving the soil from insects and earthworms. No-till soil systems, that's something that we do discuss in the Intro to Soil class. It's great. No-till is a wonderful goal. It takes a while to work up to that. I don't want anybody to come down on themselves because they're still tilling their soil in some ways. There are more conservative and less conservative ways of tilling your soil to maintain soil structure, to maintain the earthworms and the insects, to, disrupt the soil less. But buying a piece of property and expecting to start a no-till system in your first growing year is highly unlikely. It takes a while to set that up, but once you are in a no-till system, a large factor into what does move the soil and sort of mix things up, that's going to be your earthworms and insects. And then, of course, some organisms do cause or carry diseases, which we talk about in integrated pest management every fall. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the soil atmosphere. So, the same atmospheric gases that you and I are breathing right now are also present within the soil system, but they are present in different proportions. So above the surface of the soil, we have we have photosynthesizing plants that are converting CO2 in the atmosphere into oxygen versus down in the soil system, we have aerobic organisms like our bacteria and fungi and our insects, but there are no leaves down there performing photosynthesis and releasing oxygen into the soil system. So we have higher concentrations of carbon in the soil system and lower concentrations of oxygen, which is why it's important to not try to jump right into a no-till system until you have a soil structure that sort of maintains itself and has a natural passive gas exchange. We do need to break up the soil on a periodic basis. That totally depends on the texture of your soil, how much organic matter you have, what kind of amendments you're adding, how cold is your climate, what is your soil's bulk density situation, all of that stuff plays into it. Um, but we do need to remember that plant roots also require oxygen, so it is important to promote an exchange of fresh atmospheric gases in the soil periodically. Okay, here's my favorite, soil moisture. So, there are three different forms of soil moisture. The first is gravitational water. And I'm going to use an example in a potted plant. Let's say we take this potted plant, it's time to water it. I am going to fill water at the top all the way to the brim, and then it's going to start flowing out the bottom. The water that is flowing out the bottom with the forces of gravity is gravitational water. So after all of that soil or all of the water has flown out with gravity, what we're left with is capillary water. That is water that is maintained in the spaces between the soil particles against the forces of gravity, right? Whoops. So the capillary water, that's the sweet spot. That's the Goldilocks spot. That is water that is available for plant uptake. Plants are not able to take up gravitational water because there's too much of it and it's moving. Capillary water that's just sitting there, then the root hairs can reach out, touch that water, and through osmosis, pull it into the fibers of the roots. Then, as the plant drinks up that water, or if you're here in Central Texas with us, it evaporates out the top. We lose water until we are left with what is called hygroscopic water. And that is an amount of water that is, while present in the soil, it is so tightly capped around individual soil particles. There's so little of that water that the surface tension is too tight to be broken by either plant roots or by evaporation. So while there is water in the soil, it is not available for plant uptake, and that is hygroscopic water. So we're always looking for that sweet spot, that capillary water in the soil. Now, gosh, we're covering a lot right now. I hope you're still with me. So we are now moving into soil fertility. Plants and soil organisms, as I mentioned before, require nutrients and fuel to complete tasks and activities and growth and maturity. And so there are 16 essential nutrients required for plant growth. We start with the macronutrients. The first three you see listed here are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Those are part of the body of the plant, the carbon-based organism, and all three of those come from the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, water, and oxygen. The next three we have are N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are going to be the big three that you look for in your fertilizers. So when you look at a container of fertilizer, you're going to see three numbers with dots between them. Here's where I like to get my board out. So you will see something like this. So if you get a fish emulsion, something real nice and light and water-based, it could be a 111. It might be a 511. So that has more nitrogen. It's 5 parts nitrogen, 1 part phosphorus, and 1 part potassium. Versus something like a younger citrus plant that you might buy at a nursery center. You might want to start that one off with a 13, 13, 13. So it's 13 parts nitrogen, 13 parts phosphorus, 13 parts potassium. Then the last three we have on this list are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. So those are all considered macronutrients. They are required for plant growth in larger amounts than the micronutrients, which include manganese, molybdenum, iron, copper, zinc, boron, and chlorine. So when I was getting my degree in agronomy, my favorite soil science instructor, Dr. Carrie Green, would help us remember all of those with C. Hopkins Cafe, managed clean by mine cousin Mo. So if you look at the starts with the C for the carbon, C, H, O, and it's out of order, P. Anyways, you get it. It's kind of fun. We go over it in soils class. So, how do you analyze a soil? Uh, first, why would you analyze a soil? Let's say you want to grow something. Let's say you are like me and you want to get off grid and you want to homestead and you are looking at property and you want to make sure that you are starting with something that you can grow in pretty quickly. Um, you are going to want to analyze the mineral content. What is the texture? What are the relative proportions of sand, silt, and clay? Is there any organic material present? How tightly is the soil structure compacted? And are there already organisms growing? So if you're looking for some land to grow on, if it's growing anything, even if it's weeds, well, and let's be fair, a weed is just a plant that's growing where you don't want it to grow. So a cucumber in your tomato field could be considered a weed. But if you go out and you start looking for a diversity and variety of plants growing in any given soil system, you know that there are organisms living in the soil underneath them and that you have a robust ecosystem in there. So that's a good place to start planting and growing. So soil forms over hundreds and hundreds of years. You can't make a soil build a soil in 5 years. You can build up an existing soil, but soil is formed by these five factors and they all work in tandem with one another. So none of them are more important than the other, and none of them can be taken out of the soil forming process. So the first is parent material. Here in Central Texas, on the west side of I-35, we're on a lot of limestone. We're on a lot of caliche. So our parent material is high pH limestone. When you get further out towards Enchanted Rock, that is granite. So that is a granite parent material. Other parts of North America have shale parent material. Um, the original mineral fraction is going to be determined by the parent material, and that cannot be changed, and it's found where it's found. It was here long, long, long before us. The second one is climate. Um, are there swings in temperature? If if the parent material is exposed to uh, strong swings in heat and cold, it means that that rock, that parent material, will swell and contract, which means it's going to crack eventually. And that's going to impact how larger rocks break all the way down into smaller rocks and then into gravel and then into the mineral fraction that makes soil. Are there a lot of water events? Has the parent material been uh, battered with heavy precipitation? Climate also plays directly into the organic material. So, if we think about the difference between the deserts of the Southwest and their climate, and how the climate impacts the organisms that grow there versus Hawaii, which has very different soil, very different climate, very, very different organisms. The plants and the animals that the plants support in Hawaii are dropping a lot of organic material in the form of litter and waste onto the surface of the soil, which then gets broken down by these hungry, hungry organisms that live on and in the soil system versus out in the desert where there is not a lot of rain and there is not a ton of vegetation, and the vegetation has, I mean, we're talking about cacti here. They have to hold all of their stuff in to make it between the monsoon seasons and the rains. So there's not a great amount of organic material that falls on the desert floor. So in the desert of the Southwest, we see more of the sand and clay. We see a lot more of the mineral fraction than in Hawaii, where everything is that really rich humic material on the ground. Topography also plays an important part. The soil that lives at the top of the slope is going to be very different from the soil that lives at the bottom of the slope because gravity is going to draw things down over time. So there's going to be a higher concentration of nutrients and minerals at the bottom of a slope, and then at the top of the slope, depending on the organisms that live up there, we might see less. So topography plays a big role, and then of course time. Time is the magic ingredient that cannot be simulated in a real world system on field scale. So it takes centuries, hundreds and hundreds of years to develop a soil. So now we get to the big questions. Why do people take this class anyways? It's not because they want to hear more about soil forming factors. It's they want to know what kind of soil is right for me. And what do I do about my bad soil that has terrible behavior and chain smokes? It totally depends on what you want to grow. Do you want to grow native Texas plants? They're going to do well in your native Texas soil. Um, there are some soils that can be amended with organic matter and pH adjusting materials and soil amendments that can support growth of non-native plants. But somebody here in Central Texas that wants sort of like a tropical ornamental landscape, you're going to need to bring in soil that is going to meet that because the native Texas soil is not going to support those plants. So, and same thing goes for a lot of people who want to have their home gardens. There is nothing wrong with building up your soil, and there's nothing wrong with getting a raised garden bed and ordering soil that you want to fill that garden bed with. So it all depends on what you want to grow. You decide that first, and then you work towards making informed decisions about what characteristics is your soil going to have in order to support the plants you want to grow. Um, so let's say you already have your soil system. You just bought a piece of property. What do you do next? Some people like to go for broke and send off samples into a soil lab for testing. Um, you can do that, but unless you know how to read a soil test, which have to have a lot of learning for that. You're gonna get a piece of paper and you're gonna have to call me up and schedule some office hours and have me help you read your test results, versus just learning how to go pick up a handful of soil, rub it in your hand, and figure out what's the soil texture. If it's gritty, there's sand in it. If it's smooth and silky, there's silt in it. If you get it wet and it's sticky against your fingers, it's got clay. If it's a little bit of all three of those things, you've got sand, silt, and clay. How do you know what you have specifically? I have a lab where we test it in a glass mason jar and we measure the bands of sand, silt, and clay, and we see what the actual percentages are in your soil. Next, how do you know what nutrients you have? Really, the most important thing you need to know, unless you're going into like some very high-end, uh, production system for, I don't know, specialty peppers or herbs or cannabis or whatever the case may be, in which case you do need to hire a consultant to help you with your soil. If you are just buying a new piece of land or you are getting ready to plant your home garden for the next season, I love this soil testing kit. It gives you pH, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. This particular thing, I think it's like 15, maybe 16 bucks here in 2025 at least at a garden center. It gives you 10 tests of each, so you can test multiple spots multiple times, which is always great. And the results come out well. I have seen a lab test off of a certain piece of soil and then run this test up against it and looked at both of the results and they're the same. So this is a great cost-effective, efficient way to go. And then finally, the last question is always, how do I fix my soil? There is no instant fix. Changing the structure, the health and the quality of your soil takes time, patience, and humility. It's not something that can be done overnight, and it's not something that can be done once. Soil is a dynamic living organism, and you got to work with it. You got to give it what it needs. You got to give it time. It's going to go through seasons. It's going to have periods of high microbial activity, and then it's going to cool down for a little bit, and you just can't force anything. But the number one thing is organic matter. Add more leaves, add more compost, stir things in, rent yourself a rototiller and mix in all of the compost you have. Buy some compost. As an aside, never accept free compost. Never accept free compost. You don't know what you're getting. Always know your dealer, and it's something that's worth spending money on or making yourself. Do not get free compost. But mix everything you can into your soil and encourage all of that microbial growth. So, um, that is what I wanted to share with y'all today. Thank you so much for being interested. Thank you for being part of the solution. If you own a piece of property, if you rent a piece of property, if you are the steward or manager of any size of soil, you have the opportunity to be part of the climate change solution by growing things. Grow lots of things, grow a diversity of things. You don't need a whole lawn. I mean, if it makes you happy, it makes you happy, but what if you naturalized it and made it look clean and manicured, but had 8 to 15 different types of plants growing in your soil, and then you would get all of these amazing associated microorganisms that are going to bank the carbon out of the atmosphere and, give you that satisfaction. So again, I'm Professor Beams. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. You can find me through the Austin Community College website if you have any questions, and I hope that you enjoy your plants and your soils and learning more about them.